Hey folks, this is Marco here. Thank you guys for joining. Before we get started, I just want to make sure everyone can hear me, we can see me. Um, it's currently a storm outside, so hopefully my connection will stay in. Awesome. Sounds great. So thank you again for everybody who was able to join. Today's topic, we're going to look at Revit best practices using cove.tool sketch Revit plugin in order to upload your geometry. I am going to cover some of the initial steps, like how it works, and then go into the more detailed workflows, like some of the best practice tips, which you want to avoid, some definitions, clarities, all that kind of stuff. So thank you again for joining. This session is going to be recorded and posted on our website, and if you'd like to receive a copy of today's presentation, just reach out to a sales associate or Cami who should be watching the chat, and we'll send that information out to everybody. So I'm going to go ahead, share my screen, and get started. Pull the presentation. Cool. Oh, I want the PowerPoint. Yeah. So quick look at the agenda. Today's session is going to be a 30-minute session, and we're just going to quickly go through all of the different steps. If you guys have any questions, feel free to drop those questions into the chat box for today's session. First, I'm just going to do a quick overview of all of the plugin related resources, so you know where you can download the plugin, where you can watch tutorials, where you can read more about the tool on your own time. And then we're going to go through the Revit plugin workflow, making sure you know what geometry you need to export into Cove Tool, and then a majority of our time is going to be focusing on part four, which is tips for clean geometry, fast export, so on. So thank you guys again for joining, and make sure that uh, you take a note of all of the articles that we have listed to the right of the presentation. These are going to be the main articles that you should use as you're setting up and exporting your own geometry. So first slide, talking a little bit more about the apps and resources that we have published. All of the information that you are going to need to know about any of the plugin workflow process is going to be on the Cove Tool plugin app store. Currently, we have all of the plugins that we're currently compatible with published on our app store at cove.tool/app store. I want to keep repeating that. If you click behind any of these panels, you'll get to learn a little bit more about any of these different plugins. You'll also have the ability to download the latest version of the plugin. Currently for Revit, we're compatible with versions 2017 through 2021. And the next couple of weeks, hopefully by the end of next week, we'll have the new Revit plugin version for 2022 out. And it's going to include a lot more of the updates related to some of the issues that you currently might see within the tool, and I'll talk a little bit more about those once we get to that topic. But you'll download the latest version, install it, and you should be good to go. Also on the Cove Tool plugin store, like I said, you can watch the video tutorials. There's a really great explanation of mixed use export in this tutorial that you'll see on the App Store. So check that out. I'll spend some time on explaining the mixed use process, but this is going to be the best resource for that, as well as any of the written articles that we've written on this process. As you guys are starting to export geometry to Cove Tool, if you encounter any issues, you can't figure out what's going wrong, you want some help troubleshooting, feel free to send us a message at any time. Once you are in our website, you'll have this blue circle on the bottom right hand corner where you can chat with anybody on the support team. We're available Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Feel free to send us your projects, screenshots, and we'll figure out um, what you need to do in order to get your model exported. Um, cool. Back to the presentation. So a really quick high-level overview of the Revit plugin process. Regardless of which plugin you're using, you're going to follow the same four steps. And then depending on which platform you have, we'll have some additional buttons or steps that you can use. The typical plugin workflow is going to be first updating your login, which you'll see is the last button on the Cove Tool drop-down menu. And once you've installed the plugin, you'll see the Revit plugin under the add-ins tab with that Cove Tool icon located along the tool ribbon. So first you're going to log in using your credentials, then you're going to select your project from the projects list, then you'll create your Cove Tool views, and I'll talk a little bit about what it means to create 3D views in Revit, what kind of geometry you want to set up, what we're expecting, what you might need to do in order to clean up those 3D views and prepare it for your final export. And then finally, step four, exporting all of that geometry to get into the app. Some of the other buttons that you'll see on the Cove Tool drop-down menu are the individual export buttons. These are really helpful for troubleshooting or if you're working with a linked model where you're just trying to select certain aspects of the building geometry to be sent to Cove Tool, not necessarily the entire model at one time. Also really helpful if you have a really large model and it's taking a while for it to export. So if you go through them individually, it should be almost instant export. You'll just have to repeat that a couple of times. Also note that you'll see the Revit plugin version listed at the very bottom of your drop-down menu. Currently, like I said, we're at version 2.3.0. If you don't see that, you might need to update your Revit plugin. And soon, once we do launch the new Revit plugin, you'll see a different version name. So make sure you're all updated, and all of our users will see a marketing email or just update on the website letting you know that you should install the latest plugin. So before we get into the best practice tips, I just want to talk about some of the geometry you want to make sure you have included in your Revit export and exactly what type of geometry we're looking for. So of course, in the analysis that Cove Tool is running, there's going to be two that are most that need a model representation of of your building the most. That's going to be the energy analysis and the daylight analysis. So it's really important that we have your geometry imported correctly and that we have just the geometry that we're looking for. There's a quick little description if you'd like to spend your some time reading it through it, what exactly the different geometry categories are going to do. They're being used to calculate different factors in the energy model like heat gain, heat loss, wind drag, all of the factors that can impact your EUI cooling and heating loads, etc. They can also help predetermine some of the values that you should be using for your building's energy model, as well as other factors that are related to the geometry. The geometry that we most need from Cove Tool is going to be the thermal envelope. So the thermal envelope should be a really simple path that you can draw around your building, which separates the conditioned space and the unconditioned space or outdoor air. Um, for spaces that aren't conditioned, you don't typically need to import them to Cove Tool. So some of the examples that I have on my screen are the non-conditioned attic, garages, unheated parking, or mechanical spaces. You don't necessarily need to import it to Cove Tool if they don't have a significant um, if they're not conditioned, if they don't have a significant lighting load, they don't necessarily need to be imported into Cove Tool, unless you think you're going to use them as some sort of shading benefits. So they can be brought in through the shading device layer. And in a moment, we'll go through the 8 different geometry categories that we have in the app and what type of geometry should qualify for the export and what shouldn't. But primarily, we're just looking for geometry on the thermal envelope, which consists of walls, floors, roofs, and roofs. We also have some additional categories, but they also consist of what is inside of the building and on the thermal envelope. Um, in this slide, I once you've identified the thermal envelope of your building geometry, then you're going to have to split that up into the different geometry categories. And each of the geometry categories in our Revit plugin export process has a specific definition and will be used to calculate a specific factor throughout the building. For example, exterior walls are highly opaque, highly insulated, upright surfaces that enclose conditioned space, protect against solar radiation and heat gain. You want to make sure that your exterior walls don't extend inwards or outwards of the thermal envelope. If they extend inwards, they're typically going to be interior walls. If they extend outwards, they're going to be shading devices. So you might have to split that geometry before you start exporting to Cove Tool, because any extra amount of surface area we're getting in any of these categories, primarily the thermal envelope layers, will increase the different results we calculate for your project. So I'll go through these really quickly, some high level stuff. Interior walls, that's all of the walls inside of your building envelope. That's going to create some sort of shading difference, especially impacting the daylight model results. Windows are typically translucent, low insulators of the thermal envelope. They're mostly going to represent all of the objects of high thermal bridging. So things like doors, spandrels are also considered windows. So they'll typically automatically filter through the windows there. And soon in the next Revit plugin update, we are going to be adding the spandrels layer where we'll automatically send geometry that is opaque and is also um, lower insulated than opaque area, but not as much as the window area. So I expect that update. Roofs are the very top surfaces of conditioned space that protect against solar radiation and heat gain. So only these top levels are roofs. If you have to break up your geometry in a mixed use export, where you have your first program at the bottom and then your second program is the rest of the building, even though you've split your building into two sections and you would think that this middle level between those two programs is a roof object, it isn't. We really need to make sure that it fits the climate conditions of what we're defining as a roof. So that's just going to be a regular floor ceiling object, and you're only going to be exporting geometry to the other categories. Um, Also, since cove.tool has four required layers, which are the exterior walls, windows, roofs, and floors layers, you'll always need to export at least 1 square foot of surface area in those categories. So if you're in the early stages of design and you're just doing a quick massing model with floors, walls, and roofs, and you don't have windows yet because you're just not thinking about it, in order to meet the minimum requirement and gain access to the 3D analysis page and some of the other tools, you are going to need to mock up a quick little 1 by 1 square foot of window surface area and export that. And that should trigger access to the other pages and not impact the results because it's going to be such an insignificant amount of surface area. You won't see any bump there. So yeah, quick look at those. Yeah. So now we're just going to start talking about some of these best practice tips and making sure your export goes smoothly. So the number one tip is just to make sure your plugin has been installed correctly. This causes a lot more issues than people think. That if you didn't install it correctly, or if you didn't uninstall a previous version before you installed the current version, that's going to cause issues. So always make sure that before you install a newer version, you've all uninstalled or deleted the older version. Typically, you'll have to run the file that we give for you to run the plugin as an administrator. So if you don't have administration access, you might need to have your TI or BIM manager install that for you onto your computer. Once you have the plugin ran and you've relaunched Revit, so make sure Revit's closed as you're installing the plugin, you'll should have a window that looks like this asking you to load the plugins or the add-ins. Make sure you select the always load option. That's going to permanently install our plugin onto Revit so you can use it at any time and won't have to always go back and rerun the MSI to install the file. And then last, if you are seeing this message, Revit plugin cannot launch, this is a pretty common message and it's a result of a couple of different things. The most likely thing is you didn't install the plugin correctly. A second common issue is just Revit's being strained. So you just have to close and relaunch Revit. So just turning it on and off again should help it work. Beyond that, it might be a case by case issue. So if you do see this message and restarting Revit and reinstalling the plugin didn't work, reach out to us, send us a message, and we can help figure out what's going on. Another good practice tip is just to always locate your Revit project base point near your building geometry. The project base point is one of the three reference points that you can have in Revit. You've got the internal origin, the survey point, and the project base point. Typically, the project base point is doing the least amount of work in the different operations you can have in your model. So it's not too big of an issue to unpin it and move it closer to your building because wherever that project base point is located in your Revit model, that's where we're going to site your building once it's brought into the 3D analysis. If you don't have the ability to move the project base point in a working model, you might need to detach the model before you do your export. Because if your project base point is located nowhere near your Revit model, once you start exporting, you can have your geometry locate miles away from your actual site and you won't be able to find it in the 3D page. So we'll talk about that once we start exporting. So before I go into the other tips, I'm just going to pull up a new project and we're going to start the export process. So feel free to follow along. Always make sure you create a new project for your export or you have an existing project. I'm just going to do a basic single-use office building for now. I'm going to put it in downtown Atlanta, where I always place my buildings. Energy code, units measurement are all fine. You want to make sure that we've reached the geometry page. Once you're here, their project is going to be officially listed within your Revit plugin, so you can start the export process. So now I'm going to hop over into Revit. This is a generic U-shaped building that we typically use for demos. So let me go ahead and start the export process. Before I go through logging in and selecting creating our views, I'm going to just check the uh, base point. So the base point you can find in visibility graphics window under site, project base point, click OK. It's that circle icon with an X through it. I always know it's like right where the gumball is. So on the XYZ axis, it's located in our building. So we'll know we won't have any issues with siting. So let's keep going. Go ahead, log in. These are the credentials I use to get inside of the app. Step 2, select our project. Since we've just created our project, it should be located at the very bottom of the projects list. Some other notes while this loads. cove.tool is primarily looking for geometry that would be part of the architectural model. So you don't really need the engineer's model or the mechanical model um, when you're exporting to cove.tool. And also, if you do happen to be part of those teams and you're not part of the architectural team who might have the central file, and you're working with linked models, you might. I would recommend that you should request access to the central file, or if they can create a detached copy for you to use for the export process, um, typically. So I've selected our project. Next step, I'm going to create our cove.tool views. For anybody who's not familiar with this step, this is going to generate 7 new 3D views on our project browser. And each of those 3D views is going to represent the geometry categories that we need to set up our cove.tool models. So the plugin has already searched the entire file, and it's filtered geometry based on family type and some other object properties like function and materiality. So I'm going to open each of these 3D views. You got exterior walls, floors, interior walls, roofs, shading devices, skylights, and windows. And I'm just going to do a quick explanation of each of these 3D views, what we're looking for, and what you might want to do to clean up these 3D views. So for the fourth step, export all, the export process is just going to look through each of these 3D views and collect information from all the geometry that's currently visible. So whatever you see in this 3D view is what's going to be sent into cove.tool. So you just want to make sure that anything you don't want to be exported from this layer is hidden, and everything you do want to export, just not from this layer, that you move over to the correct layer. There's a couple of things you want to do for that. So in this U-shaped building, typically the parapet is not providing any sort of insulation or shading. So I always outright hide it. So I grab it, I hide it, and you can see it was initially created with a generic wall family. And then I have a couple of interior walls that showed up in the exterior wall view. This is because we're using a category called function of the object in order to determine whether it's interior and exterior. So anything marked exterior and is part of the conventional wall families uh, will go to the exterior walls layer, and then anything marked interior goes to interiors, and other categories or other parts of the 3D views are also using those properties to filter geometry. So I'm going to go ahead and move these interior walls over into the interior walls view. The best way to do that is to use the reveal hidden elements icon. It's that little light bulb icon you get at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to go ahead, just select some of this geometry that I know to be interior walls. I'll unhide them in this 3D view so that they now show up in this view. And then I'll hide them here so that they don't export from here. So that cleans up our 3D view. These little walls are from the um, U-shaped building entrance. So that's part of the thermal envelope. I just want to make sure we keep them as the layer. So I'm going to repeat that for the floors and windows layers. I think those typically show up as a bit dirty. So for floors, we just want the typically the structural component, the space that's going to be conditioned. everything within the thermal envelope. So I don't want courtyard or site objects. So I'm go ahead and hide that. Also, you don't want staircases, catwalks, other objects that aren't really need to be accounted for in the conditioning floor area of your space. So you just want those bigger elements. And then also I have these overhangs that were modeled with floor objects, but they need to be brought in as just shading devices. So I'm going to go ahead and switch them over to the shading device view. So grab all of those, unhide, and then hide them here. That cleans up that view. Interior walls view is good. Roofs, I want the roof objects that enclose conditioned space, which are just going to be these two, the main roof and then this vestibule roof. But I have this cantilever at the building entrance that isn't uh, enclosing anything, but it is shading something. So I'm going to go ahead and show it up in the shading device view and hide it here. Cleans up the roofs view. For shading devices, we're looking for objects like mullions, overhangs, fins, frets. You can also include three things outside of the building envelope, like trees, context buildings, site models. You just want to make sure you don't have too complex geometry visible in the cove tool export. So any highly detailed trees you want to avoid, anything like that. Highly triangulated surfaces don't want to export. For skylights, you've got general skylight objects, nothing I have to clean up here. And also for the optional layers, which are interior walls, shading devices, and skylights, if you don't have geometry, there's nothing you need to create. In order to export, you can just skip those layers and leave them empty. So for windows, again, I just want geometry on the envelope. So I'm going to hide these interior glazed partitions and doors. So I just have the envelope exported. That cleans up all of our 3D views. And then I'm going to go ahead and proceed to the fourth step, which is export all. Once we click export all, it's going to ask you to confirm your building height. And that's because the only way for us to determine your building height in a Revit model is to use the elevation markers. If your team typically models with using sea level or 100 feet above the zero plane in Revit, you might get a really wonky, outrageous building height estimate. So you just want to make sure you manually overwrite that and enter in your correct building height, which is going to be the lowest point to highest point of conditioned space. 12 meters is fine. Um, my building should be in Imperial, but that's good. And now we'll wait for the plugin to start sending all of that information over into the app. And the only information that the plugin is collecting is surface area and object orientation. Um, Things like assembly properties, U values, R values, all that kind of stuff that you could attribute to an object. None of it is being exported. We're just assuming that most users are poorly attributing their geometry, and this is a very quick, dirty model, not necessarily closed or anything like that. So once you're back into the tool, all of that is taken into account. We'll clean that geometry, and you can apply all of the different properties here once you're inside of the energy page. So we'll let that load. We'll wait for a success message. Typically takes about 30 seconds to 120 seconds to send that information over. And one quick thing, yeah, I wanted to show is the successful export message. If any of your 3D views fail to export, your first thoughts should be to just go and check that 3D view and make sure that all of your objects are compatible. So for example, let's say our floors had failed to export. I'm going to go to that floor 3D view. I'm going to do a quick selection of all of our objects, make sure we don't have anything like staircases or weird generic models, floating objects in this 3D view. We can open up our filter tool and just check that we don't have anything else we don't necessarily want to export. If it looks good, typically you might just have hit a size cap. So we do have size cap on how large your model exports can be, but typically most projects won't hit them because we're not blocking massive models. We're blocking extremely detailed, unnecessary geometry, like highly rendered trees or furniture that a manufacturer might provide. And those can be 10 times larger than the actual building themselves. So if you can't figure it out, or if you've removed all of those objects, then I would recommend going back into that plugin and then just trying the individual export buttons. So I'll export floors, click OK, let that send into the app. And once you have sent that information over to cove.tool, you can hop back into the app, click refresh, and you should see manual mode load all of the geometry that you've just sent into the app, and you'll gain the access to go ahead to the daylight analysis page. So your 3D geometry is not showing up on the geometry page. It's going to show up on that sun icon, the 3D analysis page. So our model has already successfully loaded earlier today. And we can just do a quick spot check and make sure that all of the geometry that we wanted for cove.tool is correct by just using element selections to toggle on and off all of the geometry. So if I just want to make sure all of the floors came in correctly, walls, interior walls, windows, roofs, skylights, shading devices, if everything looks good and we're happy, then you can go ahead and proceed to cite your model a little bit better, or if you're happy with its position, then you can run the analysis and start your 3D run. Yeah. One other thing I wanted to mention are some of the family or conditions in the Revit export process that causes issues. So the top three circumstances that are going to cause issues are these three. So it's generic models, linked files, and highly triangulated surfaces. We also have a whole article dedicated to these topics and what you can do about them, what the workarounds are, but I'll try to explain some of the issues right now. So generic models are typically, they're created vastly different from the rest of the geometry in Revit. They're volumetric forms that don't have centerline information, and the centerline from every object, that is what the plugin is searching for in order to recreate it. So if it can't find information like area, coordinate points when attempting to export, it's going to skip any of these objects. And typically, this is something that is associated with generic models that you didn't create yourself, or aren't necessarily just simple extrusions, but much more complicated. If you converted a Rhino model into Revit and turn it into a generic family or generic model, that typically is going to cause issues and you're just not going to be able to successfully export. This is the one condition where we don't really have a workaround at the moment. Hopefully with the new Revit plugin version, we will have one, but I just wanted to explain what the issue was with generic models. Linked files is another common circumstance that you have to do a little bit more work than usual. So cove.tool's plugin currently can't access geometry that's embedded further than beyond the surface level. So if geometry is existing in a linked file and even the user, the design team can't access the linked file to make changes, the plugin won't be able to collect that information either. So you have a couple of options. You can check out what those options are in the help article, but you can either create one cove.tool project and then export geometry from multiple locations. So if you have the core and shell model, the interiors model, you can export that information and cove.tool will recreate the building one upload at a time. So you do have the ability to export from multiple locations from different files. Um, or you can also bind the file, which is something that you don't want to do with anything that's large or complicated. Binding just makes all of the geometry um, local and saves it into the central file. So you don't have to leave that file. Highly triangulated surfaces is something I've already mentioned, but anything that's overly detailed that has thousands of little meshes. Currently, uh, our size cap is at around 100,000 meshes. And a typical skyscraper will be 30,000 meshes, and a typical highly triangulated tree will be 300,000 meshes. And you can imagine someone who has all of these rendering trees wrapped around their building, that's when you have those like 10, 20, 30 gigabyte Revit files. And we want to do everything we can to prevent any of those objects because they're just too um, complicated to bring into the analysis. And it's also going to have your results take far longer than necessary to complete. So if you can simplify them with more basic models or just use Revit massings, that should be good to go. Some of the other common issues that are really easy workarounds. Z-fighting is when you have geometry occupying the exact same space. In Revit, it's really easy to identify because you'll just pen around it and see that blue fritting effect. Just hide or delete one of those objects and you can export. With slope floors, cove.tool doesn't render slope floors with any sort of incline, so it'll just trace the floor plate, model it as a zero elevation elevation object. Just be aware of that. Nested families, the further back the nested family goes, the less likely it will successfully export. So if you have a nested family from back in 2007 and you're upgrading it to a 2022 model, a lot of the information has been lost, and currently we don't have the same way to export information from those older objects. So just be aware of that. Group models, you'll have to ungroup your geometry before you can export. And if you use grouping a lot, especially with like interiors and you're doing like interior analysis, I would recommend to wait till the last minute to ungroup your geometry, do your export, and then Control Z the ungrouping. All of that information will all be sent to cove.tool, so you don't have to repeat it. Overtasked objects, it's harder to explain, but it's just when your geometry that you're trying to send to cove.tool is way more detailed than it necessarily needs to be. So a good example we have is this prefabricated metal panel that has a bunch of different layers and surfaces to create this section. Um, when in reality, cove.tool just needs one basic surface area. And it's hard for us to build that one surface area when there's 20 different meshes going on. So you'll just get a really bad assumption for the window wall area and over exporting. And then finally, perpendicular objects inside of curtain walls, they typically just won't export. So just hosting them separately from a curtain wall or just on their own should be good to go. Repeating objects like louvers, overhangs on a curtain wall and repeating it all around your model is a really easy, quick way to model the building, but it's just not a good way for any process after that. Um, yeah. So I'm out of time, and I want to make sure I'm mindful of all of that. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to just start dropping any of your questions into the chat box or into the question box. I see a couple of them, and I'll cover them in a moment. But one thing I don't have time to cover, and it is its own topic that we might cover in a future webinar, is the mixed use export. But one thing to note about the mixed use export is in Revit, as you create multiple projects in cove.tool, you're going to see those projects listed multiple times in the project selection process. So you'll have the project name displayed and then its use type. You'll have one of those listed for every mixed use project you have in your project or mixed use type you have in your project. So you'll switch between different use types. You'll create 3D views for each part of the building you want to export, and then you'll split your building either horizontally, so different wings of the building you want to send to cove.tool, and you'll apply different strategies to them. You can do it vertically by different levels, or if you want to section it off into different components like the lobby or gymnasium versus the rest of the office building, um, and do the export there. And then cove.tool will understand um, what strategies need to be applied to different spaces, so on. Looks like we have a couple of questions. I'll answer those. If you have to hop off, thank you again for joining, and I'll be here for a couple of minutes. Um, can you use embedded Revit walls inside of curtain walls? Um, it depends. It's hard to kind of definitively say, especially within curtain wall family, what objects will consistently work and will successfully export every time. In the new Revit plugin version, since we're adding the spandrels layer as one of the new categories you can export, we do now have a way to separate uh, opaque area versus glazing area or translucent area. So that's going to be a lot easier, especially when working with curtain walls. But if you currently have solid wall area inside of your curtain walls and you're exporting to cove.tool and you want to make sure you don't include that solid wall area, you might need to play around with visibility and graphics and hide that geometry or use a rule set inside of a view template to remove that geometry so that cove.tool is only collecting the actual glaze panel for whatever it is we need to do. Another question, what is the best way to separate regularly occupied and regularly non-occupied spaces for lead daylight documentation? So yeah, the best way to do it is just to redraw your floor objects or to split them. So for example, in this model, we have a corridor going pretty much on the perimeter of this entire floor plate, and corridors you don't need to um, import as regularly occupied spaces in cove.tool. So you can either redraw the boundary and draw the boundary around the space that's going to be regularly occupied. um, if you don't want to edit your actual architectural floor object, I've seen people effectively use floor finishes to create the lead boundaries in their model without disrupting the floor plates. So if you create a floor finish, one that represents the regularly occupied spaces, one that represents the non-regularly occupied spaces, everything that's regularly occupied, you should have visible in the floors view and export there. Anything that's not regularly occupied, you want to make sure you move it over into the shading device view. That allows you to still receive that bounce. So if you're using it for a strategy to allow for further daylight penetration, but it's just not one of the categories that are you can counter scroll tool, that's what you'll have to do. So yeah, either drawing new objects or splitting up the current objects you already have. Are sloped roofs, sloped floors allowed to export into coastal? So we don't have any issues with sloped roofs. So if you have a gable roof or a pitch, they should successfully, easily export into Cove Tool. But sloped floors, which is really only a situation with parking lots and some more higher end, like museum projects, things like that. Um, you typically don't need to model sloped floors in the analysis. It's going to be something that we can easily recreate um, other ways, or they don't really have any significance like thermally in the building. They might, depending on how large it is and what the incline is, might have an impact on daylight results. But Coastal just always renders your floors flat, so we can calculate results like SCA, ASC, all that stuff. Another question: wouldn't this Revit process be a lot simpler with a Dynamo plugin? Maybe currently majority of Revit users don't use Dynamo. I think Autodesk is trying to make it a lot more accessible, easier, the plugin process smoother. I think once we have more adoption and people are interested in Dynamo, then we'll definitely create that plugin process and connect with it a lot easier. But at the moment, I think our current Revit plugin seems to work with a lot of teams. Cool. Those are all the questions I see. Um, yeah. So it looks like we covered everything. Thank you guys again for staying on, for joining today's session. Hopefully you found it really useful. Check out all of the Revit resources and our help library. We have a lot of different ways we can help you understand what the different geometry processes are and what you want to set up your model with. And then also, if you are experiencing any issues, just feel free to reach out to our support team. Again, we have a live chat team that's there to help you out, and a bunch of different articles you can always read and learn more about our plugin process. All right. Thank you all again for joining. Hope you have a great rest of your day. See you all, and goodbye.